Under a sky brushed with the pale wash of early dawn, the Montana Badlands stir with promises of endless wide-open plains and secret heartaches. At Salt Creek Ranch, a weathered homestead marred by time and solitude, a hushed laughter broke the still air as a motley band of riders circled near the wooden corral. Their voices carried a blend of ridicule and derision, echoing across the sagebrush and moonlit canyons. It was on this bitter hour that Tate, a solitary cowboy whose eyes bore the sorrow of a tragic past, first beheld a spectacle that would change the course of his lonely journey. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. In the midst of the mocking cavalcade stood a woman, her delicate frame bent with quiet dignity despite the obvious physical ailment that slowed her every step. Her name was Evelyn, though none of the cruel riders had ever bothered to learn it. Instead, they had dubbed her the Limping Bride as a jest, a poor excuse for a trophyman to mock Tate's persistent loneliness. With each limping step, dust swirled around her worn boots, and yet something in her gaze, a mixture of defiance and fragile hope, spoke of battles fought long before this moment. Tate, leaning against the weathered post of the ranch's main barn, watched with a quiet intensity. His hands, calloused from years of hard labor, gripped the handle of a battered leather satchel. The laughter of the riders stung him deeply. He had known cruelty all his life, yet their unthinking disdain ignited something within him, a desire to protect the bruised and the broken. For Tate, whose own family had once been ripped away by the cruelty of fate and corruption, the sight of a woman unbowed by physical pain was a reminder that even the most wounded souls deserve kindness. "Look lively, boys," jeered one rider, a sneer twisting his weathered face. "Our joke bride is here to bring luck, or a good laugh at least." His words, intended to wound, instead stirred the embers of compassion in Tate's heart. Quietly, he stepped forward from the barn's shadow, his gait measured but purposeful, as if each step carried the promise of redemption. The riders' laughter faltered into uneasy murmurs as Tate approached Evelyn. He offered no crisp retort, and indeed, his gaze was not one of mockery, but of quiet reverence. "Miss," he said softly, his voice rich and deep as the twilight, "may I have a word?" His tone held no imprecation, but only genuine concern, as though he recognized the pain hidden behind every labored step. The riders, stung into silence, watched from a distance as Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise before a slight nod broke across her face. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound was out of the wind, a low, mournful sigh that carried tales of ancient trails and heartbreak. Evelyn lowered her gaze shyly as Tate spoke. "I've seen many pass through these lands, some with scars you cannot see, but I never expected to meet someone who endures with such quiet strength." His words, unadorned but laced with empathy, resonated deeply in the chilled morning air. The subtle kindness in his tone cut through the veneer of cruelty that had hung over her all too long. Though her limp made every step a painful reminder of past hardships, an injury inflicted by both nature and ill fate, the resilience in Evelyn's eyes hinted as spirit stronger than any physical ailment. "I've learned that a broken step does not mean a broken soul," she replied softly, her voice trembling like a whispered secret shared between kindred spirits. In that fragile exchange, the world around them seemed to pause. The mocking riders receded into a dull murmur, and even the wind appeared to draw a breath in quiet solidarity. Yet, as the tender moment unfolded, a darker note began to resonate on the fringes of Salt Creek Ranch. In the distance, beyond the echoing laughter and the gentle murmur of admiration, a low whistle carried on the arid wind, a sound that signaled trouble. Rumors had long floated like dust in these parts of a roving band of outlaws, hardened men with hearts as cold as the winter's chill, whose intent was to harass any who dared defy the unjust order of corrupt local lords. Their presence was a shadow that loomed ever near, a threat that had transformed many a lonely rider into a broken man. Tate's eyes narrowed as he listened to that distant call, a warning that danger was not merely a matter of derision, but an ever-encroaching specter poised to upend his tentative embrace of newfound hope. He knew too well how fragile trust was in these brutal lands. Even a moment of levity could be shattered by the harsh realities of frontier justice. "There's more to this day than just jest," he murmured to himself, a solemn note creeping into his words. It seems the winds carry ominous tidings. The riders, whose earlier jocularity had masked their own insecurities, exchanged uneasy glances. Their curses and jeers faltered as the sound of distant hoofbeats, heavy, purposeful, and chillingly resolute, grew louder. Tate's gaze swept over the assembled men, noting with a pang of sadness that their cruelty was itself a product of a harsh, unforgiving world. Yet no one stepped forward until one whose eyes burned with undisguised malice cleared his throat. "Let this be a lesson for a fool who dares to take us for a jest," he spat, the words heavy with unspoken threats. Evelyn, aware of the impending danger, looked toward Tate with apprehension mingled with a spark of gratitude. She had been cast aside and mocked, yet in the quiet strength of his intervention she recognized a promise, that she might finally be seen not as a laughingstock, but as someone worthy of dignity. Tate, for his part, offered her how a cowboy does a quiet smile, a subtle upturn of the corner of his mouth that held both reassurance and avowed protection. Then, as if orchestrated by fate itself, the sound of those distant hoofbeats crescendoed into the unmistakable timbre of an approaching threat. The mocking riders scattered in a disorganized clamor, leaving behind the residue of their earlier disdain. In the confusion, Tate extended a hand to Evelyn, inviting her to step away from the clearing and to share in a path less trodden, the solitary one that leads deeper into the sheltering arms of the Badlands. "Come on," he said softly as he guided her toward the low hedgerows and wind-scoured rock formations that marked the frontier's refuge. "There's a safe trail out here, one where we can leave these fools and their bitter jest behind." His voice was both a command and a caring promise, resonating against the backdrop of a rising sun that promised warmth after the long, cold nights. As they started down the narrow path, the dark silhouettes of the hostile riders blended into the distance, swallowed by the vast horizon, yet the threat loomed, a quiet, relentless whisper at the edge of every step. In Tate's mind stirred doubts of what might await beyond the familiar ridges of Salt Creek Ranch, bandit raids, corrupt lawmen, and the ever-present specter of the unforgiving West. Evelyn, limping yet unyielding, shuffled alongside him. Though her step faltered still, the steel glint in her eyes spoke an inner resolve that had only grown stronger amid the jeers and threats. "I know my worth," she murmured almost to herself, her words carrying on the hushed wind. "Perhaps this joke is fate's way of giving me a chance to prove that even a wounded soul could be the heart of a rider's pride." Tate's heart, long closed to the world's tenderness, beat a little faster at her words. In that instant, as the first sunbeam scattered the lingering mist and painted the ridges in gold, he knew that their meeting was no accident. It was a moment of reckoning, a silent promise that even in a land as barren and callous as the Montana Badlands, there was space enough for redemption and for a love that would defy every cruel jest. But as the duo rounded a bend in a rocky trail, a low, foreboding cry echoed from over a distant rise. The sound, almost drowned out by the rising chorus of mourning birds, carried a warning of approaching danger, a bandit emblem known to be the harbinger of trouble. Tate paused, every muscle tense like a drawn bow ready to release its fury. The threat was real, its presence palpable in the rustle of dry grass and the echo of galloping hooves far off in the distance. In that charged moment, as the light of dawn wrestled with lingering shadows, Tate's eyes met Evelyn's. Their unspoken bond, born of mockery and nurtured by shared heartbreak, steeled itself for the trials to come. The vast Montana expanse whispered its secrets in the rising wind, secrets of hope mixed with sorrow, of redemption waiting just beyond the horizon, and of a love that might yet transform the lonely heart of a cowboy. With a final, determined glance toward the distant threat, Tate gripped Evelyn's hand a little tighter. "We'll face this together," he promised softly, though the echo of that vow trembled on the edge of uncertainty. as the sun ascended higher, banishing the darkness and casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. The peril grew ever nearer. A solitary cry from beyond the crest hinted at an imminent showdown, a harbinger of a challenge that would test their newfound bond. And so, with the promise of a new day illuminating a treacherous path ahead, Tate and Evelyn pressed on, stepping into the unknown with hearts full of quiet defiance and hope, a hope that would one day transform a joke into the pride of every rider who called these wild lands home. The echo of that distant, warning cry still reverberated in Tate's ears as he and Evelyn pressed onward along the narrow trail, winding through wind-carved ridges and sagebrush plains. In the lingering semi-darkness of early morning, the source of the cry gradually revealed itself, a lone, ragged figure scouting ahead. His cry, more a low, mournful warning than an outright battle call, belonged to a bandit scout sent by a corrupt local lord who believed the ranch's vulnerable keeper to be a liability. The scout's presence meant that the threat had not abated. It had merely shifted like shadows beneath a low, trembling sky. With heart pounding like distant hooves, Tate signaled for Evelyn to quiet her steps as they ducked beneath a clump of wind-whipped junipers. Hidden behind nature's sparse cover, they watched as the scout, cloaked in tattered fustian and face half hidden in shadow, crept along the rocky slope. His eyes, glinting with predatory intent, swept methodically over the barren land. In that tense moment, every whisper of dry grass and every minute shift of dust seemed amplified, the vast Montana Badlands now a stage for imminent danger. Once the scout vanished into the embrace of the coming dawn, Tate exhaled slowly. "That was no harmless wind," he murmured, gazing across the open trail as soft light began to bleed over the distant ridges. Evelyn's steady gaze met his, and she nodded, her lips pressed into a firm line of resolve despite her physical pain. Their flight, forced by both cruelty and the whisper of bandits, had bonded them further with an unspoken understanding. Survival in the wild needed not only strength, but trust. As their horses trotted toward the relative safety of Salt Creek Ranch, the early light revealed more of the rugged landscape. The vast terrain shimmered with dew, and the scent of pine mingled with the lingering musk of dust and sweat. Along the way, a small group of ranch hands emerged from a scattered outbuilding, their eyes widening in surprised welcome and cautious intrigue at this unexpected pair returning to their domain. Among them was Jonah, a young hand whose curiosity softened his otherwise wary demeanor. He helped secure the horses as Tate and Evelyn dismounted near the worn, wooden steps of the main barn. Evelyn, despite her limp, exuded an air of quiet dignity. With tender care, she approached the restless mare behind the corral, a creature known to be difficult to tame after a recent bout of fear, and with soft commands and a gentle touch, she calmed the high-strung animal. The mare's frantic whinny subsided into a gentle murmur as she accepted Evelyn's guiding hand, a subtle testament to the woman's innate skill and empathy. "You've got away with these horses," one of the hands commented softly, his tone a mixture of admiration and envy. But across the yard, a sneer slithered from among the riders. Carter, a haughty man known for his sharp tongue and bitter pride. "Or maybe it's luck," he drawled, eyes dark with resentment, "that a joke bride has her charms." His words, meant to wound, were drowned by the murmur of approval from others who recognized the spark of competence in Evelyn's eyes. Inside the quiet corridors of the ranch, Tate and Evelyn found a moment of respite in a small, time-worn shed where tin lanterns cast flickering patterns on creaking wooden walls. Over the gentle clamor of hushed voices and the low murmur of the wind outside, Tate pulled from his satchel a small carved comb, a keepsake made by his mother, and offered it to Evelyn. "Sometimes memories of what we've lost are all that remind us why we must keep moving," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the delicate carvings of a long-forgotten promise, and in that silent exchange, she revealed a part of herself seldom seen. "I was born with this limp," she confided quietly, while her hand absently brushed over the scar near her ankle. "Not just from an accident, but from a betrayal I can scarcely speak of. They thought me weak, a jest to be tossed aside. But over time, I learned that every fault, every wound, holds a seed of strength if only we dare to nurture it. Her words, delivered with aching vulnerability, resonated in the dim light of that humble sanctuary, forging an even deeper connection with Tate, whose own losses and struggles were etched into every line of his weathered face. Outside, however, the reprieve was cut short. As the early morning light grew bolder and painted the ridges with gold, subtle disturbances, the track of a pair of ill-groomed horses, cloven prints pressed into the soft earth, betrayed the continued presence of the bandits. The scouts' earlier warning was only the beginning. Rumors of a raided outpost near the outskirts of the ranch, signified by a crude carving left on a weathered boulder, a symbol distinct and foreboding like a talisman against hope, had begun to circulate among the ranch hands. This mark, carved with jagged line and a crude emblem, was a stark reminder of corrupt local power that sought to control the frontier with an iron fist. Later, as Tate and Evelyn joined the crew for a midday meal of weak stew and stale bread in the open barn, the tension was palpable. The chatter of the ranch hands was punctuated by whispered warnings and furtive glances toward the horizon. In a quiet corner, while the sun cast long, dappled shadows on the wooden planks, Jonah, a young and earnest hand, leaned in and murmured, "I heard the bandits struck at the old mill. They left that carving as a curse, or perhaps as a marker. Whoever dares challenge the law of that corrupt man." His hushed tone sent a shiver through the nearby listeners, and even Carter's sneer seemed to falter as uncertainty crept into his eyes. After the meal, Tate and Evelyn rode together along a dusty trail that curved around pine-clad knolls, the weight of the new threat settling heavily upon them. The valley, with its cool shadows and echoing calls of distant hawks, bore witness to a quiet journey of introspection and determination. With each rhythmic sound of hooves on cracked earth, the bond between them solidified, a resolve not to be cowed by mockery or the cruelty of unjust power. Stopping for a brief rest near a small creek where water burbled beneath flickering reflections of a waning sky, Tate set down his tin cup and offered to Evelyn, "Every step we take is a defiance of those who say we are less than what we can be," he said, his voice low and resolute, as he took a slow sip. "I lost my kin to the greed of men, and every day I wake, I vow never to let that be in vain." Evelyn's eyes glistened as she cradled the cup. The simple act of sharing warmed a metaphor for the sanctuary she hoped to build. "I've spent my life on the fringes," she murmured, mocked and pushed aside. "But I believe that with time, actions can mend hearts and redefine what it means to be strong." The words, soft as a murmur of the creek, carried the weight of her dreams. A city of free riders and steadfast ideals rising in the bleak heart of these badlands. Yet as they rode back toward Salt Creek Ranch, the ominous signs of the bandit threat grew ever more tangible. A distant plume of black smoke, rising like the vestige of an old wound, was seen over a cluster of junipers along the western ridge. The sight was enough to make even the hardiest rider's heart tremble, a sure sign that the raiders had struck again, this time leaving behind their grim signature. As the ranch came into view, a tinge of unease shrouded the familiar buildings. The carved symbol, now unmistakably fresh and defiant, was etched into the big oak door of the ranch's main barn, a mark that spoke of imminent retribution from forces allied to the corrupt lord. The message was clear. The bandits, far from being restless phantoms in the night, were asserting their claim with blood and timber. Inside the barn, tension reached a quiet crescendo as Tate gathered with the ranch hands to discuss next steps. Carter, his earlier mocking arrogance replaced now with a wary edge, spat out his disdain. "We're sitting ducks. If that curse mark is any measure, we'd be fools not to heed the warning." His voice, though gruff, revealed the fracture within the crew, a division between old resentments and the growing hope that Tate and Evelyn had begun to inspire. In the midst of the subdued turmoil, a sudden, shrilly cry echoed from the far end of the barnyard. Heads turned in alarm as a young hand, eyes wide with fear, rushed into the main hall. "They're closing in. There's someone at the western wall, and they're not alone." The words were barely a whisper, yet they carried a weight that froze the hearts of everyone present. Tate's hardened gaze swept the room, briefly, before meeting Evelyn's. In that silent exchange lay a shared terror and determination. The threat, now unmistakable, was no longer a distant memory, but an active, pounding menace. The carved symbol was not a mere marker. It was a call to arms, a summons by the very corrupt power that had once torn apart families and dreams on these unforgiving lands. As the ranch hands hurried to secure the doors and ready the horses for a hasty escape, Tate quietly stepped away with Evelyn. Outside, in the cool morning air that still clung to the fading mist, he murmured, "We cannot wait for them to overrun us. We must ride back into the Badlands, to the trail, and find shelter." Evelyn, her eyes reflecting both fear and an unyielding resolve, took his hand. "I will not be the joke that they make of us," she declared softly, her voice a vow, "but the pride of every rider who dares defy the unjust." Just as they mounted their horses and prepared for a flight into the unforgiving wilderness, a sharp, metallic clang rang out from the rear of the barnyard, a sound like a trigger snapping in the night. Heads turned, breaths held, as shadows on the western ridge coalesced. Had the bandits finally breached the ranch's defenses, or was it the vanguard of something even more ominous? In that charged moment, the future of Salt Creek Ranch and a fragile hope kindled by Tate and Evelyn's defiance hung perilously in the balance, a question left unanswered in the echo of that final, resounding clang. The metallic clang that had sent a ripple of dread through Salt Creek Ranch still echoed in Tate's mind as he and Evelyn pressed onward along the moonlit trail. The earlier cry and the subsequent disarray had given way to an uneasy calm beneath a sky strewn with fractured light. As the first hints of dawn began to emerge over the pine-shadowed ridges, the source of that jarring sound was finally revealed. A trap cunningly set by bandits loyal to the corrupt lord who ruled these lands with ruthless impunity. At the far end of the ranch yard, where the rocky outcrop sloped downward into a narrow canyon, a crude snare rig from wire and old wagon chains had fallen silent after snapping taut. Its clatter against a loose boulder had produced that final, ominous clang. Tate's heart pounded with a mix of relief and renewed alarm. Relief that the danger had at least revealed itself, and alarm that such cunning was now aimed at them. Before either could speak, a figure emerged silently from the shadows along the ridge. Tall and lean, yet cloaked in an aura of hesitance, the newcomer moved with an almost ghostly grace. His face, half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, carried the weariness of one who had wandered these forsaken lands too long to be merely a chance encounter. He stopped a few paces away, studying Tate and Evelyn with eyes that gleamed like moonlight on cold steel. "I reckon you two could use some help," the stranger said in a measured tone that blended caution with an offer of aid. His voice was soft but carried the edge of experience, a drifter whose past was etched with secrets and silent betrayals. "Name's Calder," he introduced himself, tipping his hat slightly in reluctant greeting. "I've been tracking the miscreants long enough to know their tricks, and it seems fate has thrown you in their path." Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze steady despite the lingering tremor in her step, wrought by both physical pain and the emotional scars of mockery. "And why would you help us, Calder?" she asked, her tone even but laced with guarded suspicion. Not many strangers show such kindness around these parts. Calder's eyes flickered with something akin to remorse before he answered. "Perhaps I've done wrong enough in my own way," he murmured. "Or maybe I merely understand what it is to be cast aside by those in power." His admission, half-uttered, hung in the cool air. It was clear that Calder's motives were not entirely virtuous, nor was his past completely unsullied. But in that moment, his presence offered a fragile beacon of support in a land where every ally was hard-won. Tate, still on high alert from the earlier threat, regarded Calder with skeptical pragmatism. "We appreciate your words," he said slowly, "but help comes at a price out here. How do we know you aren't one of them?" His eyes, dark and seasoned with loss, searched the drifter's face for any sign of deceit. Calder inclined his head, as if weighed by memories of lonely travels. "I know rather well the sting of betrayal, Cowboy," he replied quietly. "I once rode with men who'd carve your name from the map for a pittance. I have no love for the corrupt lords who prey on the weak. Consider my assistance a debt I hope never to fully repay." His words, sincere yet ambiguous, left Tate torn between caution and the desperate need for guidance. In that tense silence beneath a sky where moonlight fractured on rocks like shards of silver, Carter's resentment lurked in the background. The man who had mocked Evelyn from the start now glowered from across the barnyard, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Calder's intervention. His sneer deepened, and the unspoken rivalry between him and Tate flared like a flickering flame threatened by a cold wind. It was clear that Carter's ambition to belittle Evelyn was driven not only by cruelty, but by a bitter desire to preserve his misguided notion of supremacy among the riders. Inside the barn's rough-hewn shelter, while the others began gathering their scant belongings, Tate gently took Evelyn's hand and led her toward a sheltered nook by a tin lantern whose glow mimicked the steady pulsing of hope. There, away from prying eyes and the restless murmurs of betrayal, he produced a small braided cord from his satchel, a keepsake fashioned by his late mother from strands of wild horsehair and soft cotton. "This," he said, handing the cord to Evelyn, "was my mother's last gift to me. It reminded me that even in our darkest moments, we carry the strength of those who love us." His voice, rough with emotion, softened the hardened lines of his face, and for one lingering moment on the quiet watch of the stars, the lingering pain of the past seemed a little more bearable. Evelyn traced the braided cord with trembling fingertips. "I've kept a piece of my own," she confessed, reaching beneath her shawl. From within, she withdrew a delicate pendant, a fragment of a brooch once belonging to a grandmother whose steadfast soul had long been a symbol of resilience in her family. Maybe one day, these tokens will remind us that our scars are not only marks of our losses, but also the emblems of our survival. Her words were soft, barely a whisper, yet echoing with a profound realization that even those scorned by fate can rise to embody something greater than the sum of their wounds. As the small group huddled together amidst the relics of cherished memories, Calder took a moment to glance toward the distant ridge. "The bandits mean business," he stated flatly. "Earlier, I traced fresh tracks heading toward the old mule corral on the northern face. That carved mark you saw on the oak door was only the beginning. They're sending a clear message to everyone who dares defy the corrupt lord's sway." His words carried a disquieting certainty that set the hearts of the gathered close in a shared rhythm of anxious anticipation. Tate's eyes hardened in resolve. If they think intimidation will keep us down and tarnish what we're building here, they're sorely mistaken. His voice, imbued with the quiet ferocity of one who has known unspeakable loss, resonated over the ranch's makeshift assembly. This ranch, our riders, it will be a refuge for those too long oppressed, a bastion of hope carved out of the very wilderness that seeks to break us. Before any further words could be exchanged, a sudden, sharp cry rang out from beyond the barn. It was a sound that shattered the fragile calm, a signal of a new threat that had snuck in under the cover of dusk. Heads whipped toward the noise as a faint outline of a figure appeared at the far end of the corral, illuminated briefly by the glare of a tin lantern swung by a nervous hand. The figure's presence was unnerving, a solitary rider whose eyes burned with a mixture of defiance and hidden sorrow. Carter was the first to react, his voice rising in a charged outburst. "That's it. Now you brought all your misfortunes here," he bellowed, his tone laced with venom. The cry, however, was not met with laughter this time. Instead, it sent a shudder through the assembled hands and riders alike. In that discordant moment, the threat of the bandits coalesced with the internal strife simmering between rival factions within the ranch. As Tate moved swiftly to intercept the newcomer, Calder stepped forward to provide cover. The stranger's face, shrouded in shadow under a threadbare scarf, was hard to decipher, yet his eyes, when they flickered into the lantern's light, held a storm of anguish and resolve. "I mean no harm if you are friends," he said, his voice as tremulous as the wind slipping through broken pines. "But if Byron's men have arrived, you've got a problem. I serve no master but the truth, and I owe a debt to those who stand against tyranny." The name Byron, a moniker known among the local outlaws, echoed ominously as a byword for corrupt authority that had long preyed on the weak. Carter's eyes flared at the mention, but his retort was stifled by the rising tension. For a long moment, silence reigned, punctuated only by the soft sound of agitation and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Tate, whose pragmatism had long been tempered by the need to protect, stepped closer to the stranger. "Your timing is interesting," he said evenly, though his hand rested reflexively on his revolver. "Who are you to warn us of Byron's wrath?" The question hung heavy, as though the very air resisted the imposition of another name upon its ancient surface. The stranger's gaze dropped momentarily, as if weighed down by memories of betrayals past. "My name is Cole," he answered quietly. "I rode with Byron once. I know his ways, and I become convinced that marks like the ones you see are not just symbols of intimidation. They're a promise of retribution for every wrong done." His admission was raw and unvarnished, revealing a man who had turned his back on a life of complicity and is now redeemed by an uneasy alliance with those who fight for justice. In a heavy, thoughtful silence, Tate exchanged a look with Evelyn. Their shared glances, filled with unspoken determination and newfound hope, seemed to seal a silent pact. With Cole's arrival, the stakes had been raised. The bandits, under Byron's corrupt rule, were no longer abstract threats, but a tangible, growing menace. As Cole outlined the fresh tracks he had seen, a narrow set of footprints mingling with hoofprints along a rocky path leading away from the main ranch, Tate's mind raced through the possibilities. "Should we warn the others?" Tate asked softly, his voice low as if afraid to disturb the frail calm. Evelyn, her eyes hardening with resolve, replied, "We need to move. I can see these signs clear as day. They're moving right toward the North Ridge. And if Byron's message is coming, we must decide what we're willing to risk to fight it." In that moment, the braided cord from Tate's mother and Evelyn's delicate pendant, symbols of both loss and resilience, came together as tokens of their defiant hope, exchanged silently between two souls who had found solace in each other's strength. Their bond, though still fragile, had deepened into something more, a promise of redemption forged in the harsh crucible of the Montana Badlands. Before they could act further, a sharp rustling sound from behind the sheltering trees sent adrenaline surging anew. Cole's eyes narrowed as he whispered, "There, someone's coming." The sound was like a measured step on gravel, deliberate and foreboding. Carter's face, lurking in the background among the disaffected ranch hands, twisted into a sneer that spoke of internal treachery and unspoken plans. Tate gripped his revolver and exchanged a final glance with Evelyn, an unspoken vow that, come what may, they would stand together and defy both the corrupt outside and the disloyal within. As the figure advanced into the pool of lantern light, the tension reached a breaking point. Cole tensed, and then, in a single breathless moment, a challenge was thrown into the uncertain night. Would this new arrival become an ally in the struggle, or would he be the harbinger of betrayal that shattered the fragile peace? The crisp air quivered with uncertainty as the stranger's shadow merged with those of the trees. In that heart-stopping instant, the future of Salt Creek Ranch, the aspirations of its defiant riders, and the very survival of Tate and Evelyn's burgeoning hope hung perilously in the balance, a mystery that waited unresolved as the night deepened toward inevitable conflict. Under a sky streaked with the bruised colors of pre-dawn, the tension at Salt Creek Ranch deepened to a palpable thrum. The mysterious figure who had emerged from the shadows in part, three now stepped fully into the light. A man whose cautious gait and wary eyes revealed him as a turncoat scout from Byron's own ranks. His name, he later confided in a hushed tone, was Milo. Clad in a threadbare duster and a battered hat, Milo's features betrayed both regret and resolve. He carried the unmistakable air of someone who had once been part of the corrupt machinery, now set against them, yet had chosen a different course. Milo's revelation did little to ease the minds of Tate and Evelyn. Instead, his appearance intensified the ranch's precarious atmosphere. "I warn you," Milo intoned, his voice low and tremulous as much from fear as from sincerity, "Byron's men are massing. They mean to take what they believe is rightfully theirs. You must prepare. This is only the beginning of their onslaught. His eyes darted toward the western ridge where the bandit tracks had doubled in number overnight, the earth bearing fresh imprints of violent urgency. Immediately, Tate's rugged gaze hardened with steely resolve. "Then we defend what remains of this place," he stated, his deep voice resonating over the worn planks of the barn as he stepped forward. The stolen moment of quiet from Part 3 had given way to a matter of life and land. Salt Creek Ranch was more than mere property. It was home to a ragtag assembly of souls who had long endured injustice. And now, it was under threat from Byron's ruthless ambition to seize control. The news spread swiftly among the gathered hands. Carter, who had nursed his resentment like a festering wound, scowled bitterly as he listened. His entire sneer deepened as Milo's words confirmed his worst suspicions about his rivals. "That varmint Byron plans to ruin us all," he spat, unable to hide a flash of spite. But now, even his harsh tone blended with the ambient urgency of crisis. Outside, as the vaulting pale light broke over the horizon, a bitter wind swept across the pine-shadowed valley. The sun rose slowly, splintering on rocks like shards of hope amid a sea of despair. In the ensuing hush, Tate gathered a small but determined core of loyal ranch hands. Jonah, a bright-eyed young laborer, and a couple of others whose quiet demeanors belied brave hearts, stood with him. At the center of this impromptu council, Evelyn emerged as a natural leader. "Enough idle words," she said, her voice soft but imbued with resolute authority. Though her limp slowed her steps, her mind raced with tactical acumen honed by years of surviving ridicule and scorn. "We have the land, our horses, and our hearts as our strength. If Byron's men come storming in, we'll show them that Salt Creek Ranch isn't given away as a joke. It's ours, and we will fight for it." Her words, like a clarion call, sanctified what many dismissed as a simple ranch and turned it instead into a bastion of hope and defiance. As plans were quickly murmured and orders given, Milo lingered at the edge of the crowd. His uncertain presence, already steeped in the burden of his past allegiance, drew furtive glances from both Tate and Evelyn. Tate's eyes, wary yet compassionate, met Milo's one last time. "Your loyalty, Milo, must now be measured by your actions. Prove to us that you am not still in Byron's thrall." Milo's expression shifted, shadowed by sorrow and urgency, but he nodded in silent acquiescence. Before the assembled defenders could fully rally, a shrill alarm cut across the early morning, a sound of metal clanging against wood, echoing from the far periphery of the ranch. It was a trap sprung by Byron's men. Suddenly, from behind a cluster of weathered stone walls, a sharp volley of gunfire erupted. The shot's echo ricocheted off the corrugated tin roof of the barn, and chaos unfurled as if the very earth had opened to swallow the unwary. Tate cursed under his breath, instinctively drawing his revolver and barking orders. "To the canyon now," he cried, and with a grin set to his jaw, he charged toward the western passage that led to a narrow, rocky canyon known only to a few. Evelyn, with painful determination, struggled but kept pace beside him, her hand clutching the braided cord Tate had given her as a token of hope. Behind them, the sound of disarray and anguished shouts filled the air, a cacophony that spurred their flight. Jonah and a scattering of ranch hands began trailing after, while Carter, whose resentment had for too long simmered beneath the surface, took shelter among the scattered bales, his loyalty clearly divided. Milo, too, stayed at the rear, his eyes betraying a contorted mix of defiance and guilt that hinted at depths yet unexplored. Hurriedly, Tate and Evelyn raced through the canyon, the rocky path twisting like a knife through a landscape painted in early light. The canyon walls loomed overhead, the sagebrush-lined slopes etched in shadow and gold. Every footstep echoed with both the promise of survival and the constant menace of defeat, a reminder of the brutal realities of frontier life. In a brief moment of respite beneath a natural overhang, safe from the immediate barrage, Tate halted and turned to Evelyn. Breathing heavily, he gently removed the braided cord from her hand, letting his rough thumb trace its worn fibers. I lost so much to cruelty and greed, he murmured, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. Every day out there I long for moments like this, when we could be more than just survivors. I long for a place where our scars turn into our pride. His words, rough and laden with an aching vulnerability, spoke of the loneliness that had defined his existence long before fate had thrown Evelyn into his life. Evelyn, her eyes glimmering with steely resolve and soft empathy, replied softly, "And I, too, have known the bitterness of being cast aside. But look at us now. We're no longer the jokes they whisper about. We are stronger together. I promise I will not only endure, I will lead." Her quiet declaration shone through the fear that still lingered in every breath. In that intimate, stolen moment beneath the canyon's protective arch, their shared vulnerability forged an unspoken promise to rise, even as the storm of betrayal and danger swirled ever closer. Just then, from the far end of the canyon, a faint mechanical thumping began to resonate, a deliberate, ominous cadence that suggested additional reinforcements from Byron's forces. Molly, a keen-eyed young hand who had joined the retreating band, shouted, "Look! Tracks! Fresh tracks on the ridge. They're closing in." The word sent a renewed surge of adrenaline through the canyon. Tate's jaw clenched as he met Evelyn's determined gaze, and even Milo's haunted eyes flickered with preparedness. Before their next breath, a chilling revelation burst forth from the darkness. A torn piece of paper, fluttering in the cold wind near a rocky outcrop, bore a rough sketch of the ranch along with a symbol, a mark that signified Byron's corrupt dominion. Among hastily scrawled words was a single ominous line, "Yield or be crushed." The paper's presence was a sinister herald of what was to come, and it soon became clear that the bandit threat was not only a physical assault, but also a psychological war against those who dared stand in defiance. In that heart-stopping instant, while the canyon seemed to hold its breath amidst the pounding echo of distant hooves, Tate squared his shoulders and spoke with quiet authority. "We cannot hide forever," he declared, his voice echoing along the stony walls. "We either stand our ground and fight, or we risk losing everything we've built." His words, resolute and fierce, stirred the scattered defenders who had followed him into the canyon. The moment was shattered as the sound of a newly sprung trap, a net cascading silently from above, swallowed Milo's cry. In the flurry that followed, as one of Byron's men emerged from behind a rock to snatch a fallen ranch hand, the tension escalated into a frenetic burst of violence. Tate fired a round that sent the attacker sprawling, while Evelyn, summoning every ounce of her courage, leaped forward to aid the wounded hand. Her actions defined the scorn that had once defined her. As the melee raged in the narrow confines of the canyon, Kane, a rugged, scarred hand whose loyalty lay firmly with Tate, shouted through the tumult, "Byron's men are on every ridge. We must move the highlands to the old lookout post on Pine Knoll." His desperate urgency fused with the rising chorus of determined shouts from those defending the ranch. With the bandits' assault intensifying, Tate, Evelyn, and their ragtag defenders hastily regrouped. Amid the chaos, Evelyn's unwavering leadership came to the fore. "To Pine Knoll, all of you," she cried out, her voice strong as an oath. "I will not let them turn our home into a monument of fear." Her cry, a rallying call that cut through the savage clamor of battle, stirred a glimmer of hope among the loyal hands, even as Carter Sullivan's silhouette lingered in the background, his allegiance growing increasingly suspect. As they surged along the rocky trail toward the promised shelter of the highlands, the determined figures struggled against the relentless tide of bandit pursuit. Gunshots echoed against the ancient stone, and the cadence of hooves melded with shouts and fierce yells in a symphony of defiance. In one particularly desperate moment, a bullet whistled past Tate's ear, its shock binding him to Evelyn in a silent vow to never let his newfound hope be extinguished. Then, as the group neared the craggy threshold of Pine Knoll, a natural outpost carved into mountainside, a single accusatory shout rang out from behind. Nate, one of the younger ranch hands whose loyalty had been unwavering, pointed a trembling finger toward the trail behind them. "Someone's among us!" he cried, his voice cracking in terror. Eyes darted over shoulders. in that fateful moment, as they instinctively turned to face a lurking threat, the figure of a defiant silhouette emerged from the gathering darkness, one whose presence underscored betrayal that had not been anticipated. Tate's heart pounded in his chest as uncertainty and dread swirled. Who had dared to betray their fledgling sanctuary? Was it Carter, ever resentful and scheming in the shadows? Or had another, perhaps even closer ally, turned treacherous in the crucible of desperation? As the stark highlands loomed ahead under a sky now tinged with an uncertain morning glow, the question hung perilously in the cool air, a final, wrenching cliffhanger that sharpened every sense. Who among them had betrayed their fragile hope, and what would it cost them all when Byron's forces finally descended? As the first light of dawn began fracturing the starlit highlands, an oppressive silence fell across Salt Creek Ranch's beleaguered defenses. The battle at Pine Knoll had waged with grim determination over the past hour, and the echoes of gunfire had slowly faded into the mournful sigh of the Montana wind. Now, gathered in the shaded refuge of craggy outcrop, Tate and Evelyn, side by side with their loyal few, awaited the final reckoning of Byron's forces. The air was heavy with both sorrow and the raw promise of redemption. In that taut moment of fragile calm, the traitor among them was revealed. It was Carter, a bitter and resentful man whose sneering disdain had long been aimed at Evelyn, who had, in a final act of self-preservation and envy, betrayed their plans. As Tate rallied his men to fortify their positions at Pine Knoll, a furtive glance from Jonah, a young but earnest hand, confirmed what some had feared. Carter had slipped away in the confusion of the ambush to secretly relay information to Byron's men. When Milo, the turncoat scout who had earlier offered ambiguous assistance, caught Carter in a moment of furtive communication near the outpost rickety gate, the truth burned as fiercely as any bullet. "Carter," Milo hissed, his voice dripping with bitter reproach as he stepped from behind a fractured boulder. His own eyes, stormy and unforgiving, bore into Carter's, who looked chastened yet unremorseful. "You'd risk everything we built for a sliver of gain from Byron's grasp." Carter's jaw tightened, and his eyes glittered with a mix of fear and greed. "I only did what I had to," he spat, the words laced with self-righteous bravado that quickly crumbled under Milo's fierce scrutiny. "Byron's power. He promised me safety, a future beyond this cursed ranch if I delivered you weaklings into his custody." His confession, though murmured with disingenuous pride, revealed the depths of his corruption and his terror of being overrun by forces more brutal than any mockery. Tate's hand moved to his revolver, but his eyes, burning with protective fury, held him back. "You betray our own for greed and fear," he growled. His voice, rough like the scorched earth beneath their feet, resonated over the assembly. "Your actions have sealed your fate, Carter." The word hung ominously as the traitor backed away into the gathering shadows. Even as Carter's treachery was exposed, the bandit threat, orchestrated by the notorious corrupt Lord Byron, pressed in with renewed intensity. A fresh volley of gunfire shattered the fragile respite. Out from the rocky approaches, Byron's men emerged grim-faced and methodical in a coordinated assault that threatened to overwhelm the defenders. In that chaotic onslaught, the air filled with a biting scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Cole, the drifter whose rugged past had led him into this crucible of defiance, moved with preternatural speed to intercept a charging bandit. His sacrifice was swift and fierce. A stray bullet found its mark in his shoulder. With a pained groan, Cole staggered, yet he managed to rally a nearby hand by pressing his bloodied hand against his chest and calling out, "Hold your ground. I'm not done yet." His words, though half-strangled by pain, lit a spark among the defenders, and his reckless valor bought them precious seconds. Meanwhile, Evelyn had risen to a new kind of leadership. No longer merely the mocked joke bride, she now commanded a presence that silenced even the jeers of old. As the enemy pressed in, Evelyn climbed atop a fallen log near the canyon's narrow opening and raised her voice above the tumult. "Listen well, riders of Salt Creek. We stand not as weak, broken souls, but as a family forged in hardship. We will not yield to the tyrant's greed." Her words, carrying the weight of her own scars and fierce hopes, galvanized the loyal ranch hands into a unified front. At that fateful moment, Tate and Evelyn shared a glance, a silent communion of resolve. Tate's fingers brushed gently against a braided cord gifted by his mother, while Evelyn's hand tightened around a delicate pendant that had once belonged to her grandmother. These keepsakes, emblems of past sorrows and unyielding promise, served as a quiet vow between them. No matter the cost, they would forge a future where the oppressed could rise. As the battle raged amid the rocky corridors of Pine Knoll, Milo, weakened by his earlier confession, yet still alert, moved to block the narrow passage through which Byron's reinforcements would advance. With calculated precision born of desperation, he and Jonah, the steadfast young hand, orchestrated a retreat for the bulk of the defenders. The strategy was perilous, requiring every rider and hand to feign disarray as they melted into the labyrinth of ridges, leaving behind a slender, well-guarded rear contingent. The enemy, frustrated by their inability to pin down the agile defenders, began a chaotic withdrawal as Byron's forces realigned toward more vulnerable targets. In the ensuing silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of those who had fought for every precious moment, the battered group realized that they had, for now, outwitted the tyrannical onslaught. In the quiet after the tempest, as the horizon blushed with the first hopeful radiance of dawn, Tate gathered the survivors inside the temporary refuge of a dilapidated stone cabin near Pine Knoll, a place long forgotten but pressed into service by desperate will. Evelyn stood at the doorway, her silhouette softly illuminated by the waning glow of the nascent sun. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears and unspoken determination, reflected a leader now hardened by heartache, yet emboldened by newfound hope. "Tate," she said quietly, stepping forward, "we have shown them what the spirit of Salt Creek can endure. Our loss today is a testament to the price of freedom. Yet let this defeat not consume us. Instead, let it remind us our legacy begins here. We will forge a safe haven, a sanctuary for all who have suffered under Byron's shadow." Her voice, warm and resolute despite the lingering tremor of grief, carried the promise of a better future. Tate nodded slowly, his gaze wandering over the assembled faces marked by both strife and a yearning for renewal. "Our hearts may be scarred and our hands bloodied, but out here, among these wild rocks and boundless prairies, we will rebuild what was taken from us," he vowed. His words resonated deeply, echoing like a solemn prayer across the rugged Montana Badlands. We ride toward a tomorrow where every mock and every betrayal lights the flame of justice. As the survivors began tending to their wounds, consolidating their formation, and planning their next move, the remnants of Byron's forces, though battered, had not yet been vanquished entirely. Far on the western ridge, beyond the scattered smoke and the distant calls of retreating gunfire, the ominous sound of hoofbeats persisted, a grim reminder that the struggle was far from over. In the waning moments of that tumultuous night, as the new day unfurled its hopeful promise beneath a sky splintered by dawn, Tate and Evelyn stood together on the cabin's creaking porch. Their hands, still adorned by their cherished keepsakes, met in a gentle squeeze, a silent vow that love and defiance would endure. In their eyes shone the embers of a promise, that Salt Creek Ranch and all who called it home would rise as a beacon of hope against tyranny. But even as the first light cast long, slanting shadows over the assembled riders, a distant, eerie sound, like the soft thud of a drum or the low murmur of a dying storm, echoed from beyond the valley. The faint, relentless tapping of distant hoofbeats whispered of a new challenge looming on the horizon, a reminder that while one battle had been narrowly won, the war against Byron's cruel dominion was far from over. In that fragile instant, with the promise of a reimagined future intermingling with the bittersweet taste of hard-won victory, the legacy of Salt Creek was set in motion, an enduring testament to those who dare to defy injustice, to transform ridicule into pride, and to build a sanctuary for the oppressed amid the unforgiving vastness of the Montana Badlands.